For more, I'm pleased to be joined by co-host of The Cycle here on MSNBC, Ari Melber, and Democratic pollster Margie Omero. Margie, so minorities, young people, and now women are being prevented from voting in Texas. So if the intention is to target Democratic voters, the new law, you have to concede, has been a magnificent, rip-roaring success.
It just happens to be a coincidence that the groups that are going to be most likely affected by this law happen to be the groups
strange coincidence
that don't vote Republican.
What a coincidence!
I know. It's just, I mean, it's almost as if it was planned that way. I mean, it's amazing. You see Republicans.
It was planned that way, Margie. That's the point.
It was planned that way.
It was planned that way.
I mean, it's actually not a laughing matter. It's a crime to. It is a crime to see these states around the country having these kinds of laws preventing a third of women may be affected because their licenses and their voter registration cards show different names. I mean, Republicans are unable to speak to voters, so they've decided to change what voters can show up to the polls and vote. And they probably thought that they wouldn't have there would be no consequence for this, that people wouldn't know about it, they wouldn't vote against Republicans as a result. But in fact, in 2012, you saw minority turnout higher than ever. There is a consequence for doing it, and it's great that shows and there's coverage of this consistently, and is going to continue to have a consequence for Republicans if they do this.
Ari, in one of your many iterations, you're a lawyer. You know the Justice Department is seeking to challenge this under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. Does the Department of Justice have much of a case?
They have a case because they can argue under the standard that these rules were partly adopted with the goal of reducing or diluting minority voting. Whether they don't have a case and why you're open is not just tragic comedy, Martin, but as you know, if Texas can defend this by saying we're only trying to hurt a political party, that is a defense in court to defend this.
That's astonishing. So there's a possibility that the Justice Department won't be able to overturn the effects of something that is quite clearly affecting Latino voters, low-income voters, and women.
That's exactly right. And so what you need to do there in that situation is, number one, do exactly what the Attorney General has done, which is pursue these cases, litigate them out so we learn. And number two, what the Obama administration is trying to do with some last remaining reasonable Republicans like James Sensenbrenner, which is amend the Voting Rights Act, renew the Voting Rights Act, and address some of this. The third thing you could do is try to do what they call bail-in, basically take some of these states under a different section of law, Section 3, and pull them in to the kind of coverage where we get at this in advance, not after the fact. The Supreme Court and John Roberts came in there and they shifted the burden from where it was on the states that have a history of segregation and discrimination and put it back onto the voters. And the last point I want to make is Margie's right in the short term that a lot of voters say, you know, at first they went after him, and now they're going after all of us, and we're not going to be stopped, and that can be a motivating force. So the politics of this are actually different than the justice, but we need justice on these issues.
We absolutely do. Margie, as someone who was born in Britain, I was always told that America had enormous respect and esteem for democracy, a nation of laws, a nation that loves its own democratic system. How shameful is it that a nation like that has states that deliberately and intentionally seek to undermine the voting rights of so many people?
It is a huge shame. I mean, it's one thing to have a discussion and a disagreement over whether a tax policy was going to help the economy or help others or help businesses. It's a completely different thing to have a partisan divide among lawmakers as to whether we should make it easier for people to vote or harder for people to vote. And the answer should always be easier. And that's what the American people think, and that's what every lawmaker should say.
Right. The president earlier today, Ari, spoke about immigration reform. And of course, a major part of that, the law, is that it will prevent Latinos from voting, as high numbers of Latinos don't have the means, as you know, to procure a valid ID, certainly according to the research in Texas. How much of this law is motivated by the fear that enfranchised Latino voters will turn Texas blue?
I think that's a real concern.
Do you think that's an intention, though?
I think it's hard to say for sure, especially, I mean, when the courts look at this, they look at legislative purpose, right? And what one legislator does might be different than what another does. But to the premise of your question, there is no doubt that some Republicans have spoken openly about this. One of the terms they use is caging, which is to say, let's take the current voters that are against us and cage them in. That's a piece of gerrymandering. Dilute that vote. And the other piece you're talking about is who gets in and who gets to become a part of voting. A third piece is felony disenfranchisement, which we know has racist impacts, even if it's not designed to be racist. All of these are of a piece with a frustration that's out there. The reason why I am not pessimistic is the American public is awake to this. They are hearing that the Congress isn't democratic, not in how it operates on the floor, not in how the filibuster operates, and not in the voting booth. And it makes people angry. And we know that political movements are not just built on idealism, they're also built on this anger. So if you're watching at home saying, well, what do I do about this? There's a lot that people can do as they go to the voting booth. And as this moves from this issue that we talk about sometimes because we're interested in politics to an issue that a lot of Americans are hearing about. And I think that's happening in states like North Carolina and
no
Texas.
doubt. Margie, as a pollster yourself, I mean, Ari was reluctant to answer the question directly, but do you not sense that this is a fear on the part of Republicans that Texas may well go blue if immigration reform passed and vast numbers of Latino voters ended up wanting to vote Democrat?
Yeah, I mean, look, they should be worried about all voters right now. The last 3 polls that I've seen all have shown record low approval rating for the Republican Party. So they have to worry about all kinds of different voters, not just Latino voters. And also, I would point out that it's not just Latino voters that support immigration reform. Republicans support immigration reform. People across the board, 2/3 of voters in the exit polls from 2012 said that they supported path to citizenship. That's before you even hear about all the different components of what the president spoke about today. So if their strategy is to alienate or to prevent from voting folks who they think may not be with them, then they have a lot more voters left to worry about because they are in real trouble right now.
Absolutely. Margie Omero and Ari Melba, thank you both so much.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Coming up, it's a disaster.